Well, hello there once again, and thank you for joining us on this little something that we've added to the ministry, book reviews and so forth. I just want to clarify one point, because last time we looked at this very interesting, very moving book, I thought, of the Battle of Stalingrad in 1941. And what I didn't quite make myself clear was that I was tying in Marxism, communism or socialism, or whatever you call it, one of the isms. It could be fascism, it could be Catholicism or whatever, with the theme of Darwinism run through it. And re-looking through this last night, I came across a little item here about the, now I've got to try and find it, I think. A little item about the program that the work camps were set up for these prisoners when they went there. It's a Russian word called Stakhanovitz. And it says, quote, materialism, as one of them put it, meant, quote, that man was just another material to be used and discarded. Prisoners were used as pack animals. And that's what it's all about. And all of these things in the communist state, the state is everything. The man is nothing. But the state is all, the work is all. I thought that was very, very good. We left last time with the collapse of von Paulus's Sixth Army. And you've seen, if you've watched the video, you'll have seen the columns and columns of German soldiers marching off to the camps. I'm going to come to where we think they went. The figure put there is 91,000, but I'm going to add perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 more, because fighting along with those people were Cossacks, soldiers from the Baltics, Romanian soldiers, possibly some English sympathisers of Mosley's people who went over there, and certainly some Greeks as well. And you also had a vast civilian population in charge of the animals and the kitchens and all of these sort of things there. And 2 million horses were there as well. So possibly looking at 95,000 people who marched off, paraded in front of the cameras through Moscow, because that's what Stalin wanted. Well, the big question is, 95,000 marched off to the camps. And in 1954, the new German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer announced that he was going to Russia the first time to visit Nikita Khrushchev, and as a gesture of goodwill, the Premier, Nikita Khrushchev, would release those prisoners, and some 4,000 prisoners returned home. One of them was Field Marshal von Paulus. So out of possibly 95,000, only 4,000 returned home. 90,000 of them perished. Anyway, we come to this excellent book called Gulag. It's a very deep, very moving book, very tragic book, but what it tells us is that from the beginning of the century, when the Tsar was in power, Tsar Nicholas, of course, the Romanovs, they had used a form of Gulag. The Cheka, the so-called Russian secret police, had used a form of Gulags to send dissidents there. Stalin went to one actually, and I believe some of the other top communist officials went there. But when Lenin arrived in 1918 and 1919, the die was cast to have these camps set up, possibly in the middle of nowhere, where anyone who criticised the state could be sent. And this is the history of the Soviet camps. Through the 20s, certainly through the Great Purges of the 30s, certainly in the 40s, is where I suspect many of those 90,000 plus German army was sent to some of these gulags. We'll try and find some of them in a minute. And certainly up to the 50s, when Stalin, before he died, launched the plot against the Jewish doctors. Okay then, so who was sent to these camps? Well, it was anybody who was against what Lenin was trying to bring about in the Soviet Union. The socialists, the social democrats, the anarchists, even other communists, even people he didn't like, even people he thought held a grudge against him. They would be shipped off to some of the early gulags. And I just want to find this map here, if I may, because this was a map that was drawn up during possibly the time of the Great Purges. This is 1939 to 1953. Now, you can see here that they stretch from Murmansk, the warm water port of the Soviet Navy, still is, to Leningrad, way down to Vladivostok. And of course you've got Japan there. And you can see these little camps dotted about. I've counted over 100, but looking at some other sources, they say there's possibly 200, maybe even 300. Some of them are scattered in remote places, miles away from anywhere. And the remote camps, where they're located, those areas and those terrains are rich in minerals, timber, gold, whatever, to make the Soviet Union great. this was cheap labour that could be brought in. Some of the ones near the towns you can see here, and up here as well. Now the whole thing about this was that when this was set up, Stalin gave it to the OGPU, as they were called then. They had followed from the Checker OGPU, but it later became called the NKVD under a very unpleasant man called Yagoda. And anybody that the state thought was criticising was arrested, as well as their wives, as well as their children. So out of these gulags you had gulags for the men who would work, possibly till they dropped, and most of them did. The women were brought in for labour as well, and the children would even be brought in as well to do some work. Horrific events of what happened there. Just look at some of these pictures here. James can just pan in there. The 1930s. Now this is when the gulags were really working 24 hours round the clock. You can see here prisoners breaking rocks with handmade tools. Can you see that? Handmade tools. Everything was done by hand. We dug earth by hand and carried it out in wheelbarrows. We dug through the hills by hand as well. So you just dug by hand, and that's all that you had. Here's Stalin. Stalin and Yagoda, the man I was just talking about. Small man there. The White Sea Canal to celebrate its completion. This was the highlight of the days of the 30s, that this canal had been built with bare hands. But purges come and go, and purges come against those who launched them. And Stalin, ever suspicious, was suspicious of his head of the secret police, there he is, Yagoda. And of course in the mid-30s Yagoda would be denounced. He would end up in one of the gulags, and so would his family. And the man who took over from him was a man called Yezhov. And later he would be deposed and he would be executed, and his family was sent to the camps. So all the time you got this uncertainty of what is happening there. Interesting picture here. One of the early camps, according to the author, was a camp called Kolimar. And there you can see that picture there of 4 camp commanders, Kolimar, 1950. And it says the daughter of a prisoner has written killers across the photograph. Can you see that there? Killers. Because that's what they were. They were cold-blooded killers. They would kill anyone of any age, of any nationality, if it didn't fit in with what Stalin decreed. And of course, as the purges came, many of these men were deposed. Here we see the armed guards with the dogs and so forth. And even the women were brought into work as well. You didn't escape because you were some prominent politician's wife or mother or sister. Beside a grandmother's grave in Central Asia, you see, Central Asia. Working with a camel. And outside an earth dugout, because that's all you had. You dug the earth out by your hands and you put this sort of branches above it to make a roof. The gulags. So many people went through here. So many people would perish there. What about women and children? Look at these photographs here. Polish children photographed just after the amnesty in 1941. The state of these children. Camp maternity ward, a prisoner nursing her newborn. The children be taken off to orphanages, possibly never seeing their parents again, and be used as cheap labour somewhere. Crowded barracks. A couple of years ago my son and I went to Dachau, and we saw the barracks there, and these beds, these pallets as they are, were exactly the same there, and there you see a punishment cell there. It's a very moving book, and it's a very powerful book of those who got swept up into the gulags to work to death to build up the Soviet Union. Now I talked earlier on about the 90 plus soldiers who went into captivity, and the author does allude to this, and she does mention that near Stalingrad, where the great battle was, there was a camp, one of the gulags, if I can find it, which I did have here somewhere, called Bekabab, Bekabab, you went across Uzbekistan to Bekibag. So that'd probably be one of these here, but that's a long walk, a very long walk, possibly 200 or 300 miles. And some of these journeys lasted up to 25 days. You walked in rags, as you saw in the last video that we did on the horrors and the tragedy of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Very moving book. The big question has to be at the end, when the author, Anna, comes to go through all of this, who was there, how people suffered. And she says, even when Stalin died, so many of these people in the camps, and this is the interesting thing about the Gulags and about the concentration camps, that in all of the Gulags, there were no photographs of Stalin. Isn't that interesting? No photographs of Stalin. And he seems in the Nazi camps, there were no photographs of Hitler either. Interesting that, isn't it? But she says on the day Stalin died, many of these communists who had been in these camps wept because the great general, the generalissimo, Joe Stalin, had died. And they said he didn't know what was going on. It was people like Beria, who was the head of the KGB then, who'd taken over. Interesting book. But finally she poses the question at the end, and this is, I find, very interesting. How many perished in these camps, were worked to death and so forth? And you've got to remember that millions were sent up into the north, into the Arctic Circle, again to drill for rich deposits there, by hand, who knows, well, maybe they were given a pickaxe. Many were abandoned there. There's one story of 6,500 abandoned on an island, freezing cold island. They forgot about them. They went back 2 or 3 weeks later and half of them were dead. The other half had been cannibalized, and somebody had the idea of sending them in some flour to make some bread. So they came a few weeks later and threw these bags of flour at these starving skeleton wretches there. And one of the sailors says, it was terrible to see, as we shouted, mix it with water to make some bread. And these wretches in rags were running down to the sea and mixing up this bread, but the rest of them just ate it and then choked to death. How many is the big question? Well, one figure arrived at is 17 million. This is according to Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, who took over from Stalin. And actually Beria took over from Stalin, but Khrushchev came later. He spoke of 17 million passing through the camps from 37 to 53. I think far exceeds that, because you've got to look at all of the children, all of the men, all of the women. And what about the great famines of the 30s in Ukraine? According to the author here, 6.5 million died, which is far more than the camps. Nazis' prisoner of war camps. They come up with a figure of 28 million. Certainly by the late 40s, according to the author, the figures were getting very lax. People weren't counting how many were going through the system. The paperwork began to get sloppy. And you can see here some of these figures, again, put out by Russian records. How accurate they are, I don't know. Again, 28.7 million prisoners. We just don't know. You can take a guess. Black Book of Communism, written by a French author, he came with a figure of 20 million, and so it goes on. So what I'd finally say about this book, and these are my figures, if 95,000 German soldiers and allies who worked with them marched off to the Gulags and only 4,000 returned, some 11, 12 years later, to return to Germany to see their families, we are looking at possibly 90,000 dying, murdered, starved to death, whipped, tortured, abandoned in the great Soviet Union. I would say that we could be possibly looking at figures, if they're based on what happened to the Sixth Army of General von Paulus, you could be looking at 50 million plus. Wow, that is really something. And I think the author alludes to this when she says that so much of what we cannot say, so much of the records are still locked away in the Lubyanka, where the KGB worked from then. That's all I'm going to say about this. We'll carry on this theme next time, but I do stand by what I say, and I know that some people on Stalingrad saying that I've got it wrong. But if you're going to run a state, the state has to be all. There is no place for a born-again Christian, and if you are a born-again Christian, you cannot have any time for this. And also in these camps as well, I should say, were Christians as well, Orthodox priests, Orthodox nuns, Jehovah's Witnesses and so forth. There is no place in the state for religion. Not that we support organised religion, we don't, because we've seen what organised religion did during the Inquisition, we saw what organised religion did during the First World War with the Armenians and so forth. So there's a book to read, excellent book if you want to read about the camps and where the German prisoners went. If you've got any other ideas for us to look at in this series, we appreciate it. Thank you for your time and good afternoon.